Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to see and hear you talk. However, we would like to start the second panel, which will focus on Professor Schön's presentation, i.e., we will talk about the collective and the individual behavior, a bit more abstract. That is, we will talk about the collective versus the individual unlawfulness or contravention. Now, let me introduce the speakers. Professor Coriot, Professor for Public Law at the Maximilians University of Munich, and Professor Steckler-Weithofer, who is a philosopher. As you can see, we have a broad range here. Professor Schön, Vice President of the Max Planck Institute. Professor Siegrist, a historian, and Professor Pichler, an expert for European law from Graz. And he's an expert for the acceptance of unlawfulness. And the introduction will be given by Professor Coriot, who will tell us a bit more about where we are in the discussion today. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. The topic is worthwhile. I will give a brief introduction for the second round of the panel discussion, and I want to do this by going back to what Professor Schön has told us this afternoon. He tried to describe the typologies of the contravention and distinguish the cases and see the whole phenomenon in the context of the law and legal answers to the problems we are dealing with. And I do agree to his description, because we are not talking about individual contraventions, individual cases. Because what we have said in the context of the law prevails here too. The status of the individual perpetrator only confirms the majesty of the law as such. So we don't doubt or don't put in question the law as such. However, we are dealing with a much deeper phenomenon, i.e. a phenomenon which is characterized by an overall negligence or ignorance of the law, and the right of the law to control is being undermined in many fields. Now, with respect to the answers given by the judicial system and by legal experts, I have to say I do agree to what Mr. Schön has said. The legal experts have been the first digital beings in the world. They are normally binary coded, and the differentiation between 0 and 1 is, for legal experts, the difference between lawfulness and unlawfulness. And a collective contravention is, of course, unlawful and implies that the law can give a simple answer, because the law is guided by a conservative strategy, i.e. the strategy of maintaining, i.e. contraventions have to be punished, or sanctions according to the legal prescriptions in the respective context. Now, we do differentiate lawfulness and unlawfulness, or innocence and crime, but moreover, each and every citizen is called upon in order to prevent. The prevention principle rules. This might sound old-fashioned, but there is the citizen's obligation to comply with the law and to avoid a situation of unlawfulness, which I want to stress for good reasons, because if you look at the legal systems we're having today, you understand why it's important to keep people reminding of this particular truth. But there are more answers which can be given by a legal system in view of the crisis, because if a society, i.e. the legal subjects, do not agree to the clear line which is being drawn between what is right and what is wrong, it's possible within a democracy to change the law, i.e. to shift the line between what is right and what is wrong, what is lawful and what is unlawful, and to change the law, including the basic law, which is based on the Constitution, i.e. which is the fundamental law. So the possibility to change the law is also an answer to the question of what is right and what is wrong, and which is also an answer we have to see as one option in the case of a collective unlawfulness. But other options are feasible too. For example, individual elements or parts of the system of law, of the legal system, is about to drown or to go down. Revolution is a word Dr. Flick has mentioned in order to remind us of this particular twilight. We are in the twilight of the law. I mean, this is what Germany has experienced in the past as well. Now, this is a lingering situation, so to speak, this twilight. Nevertheless, a contravention could also have a productive significance, however, only to a limited extent, because we still have the binary code which is being applied by legal experts, as I said, and there is a clear distinction between what is right and what is wrong. Yet, in this twilight situation, one could go and develop strategies in order to furthermore strengthen the legal system, and that's all I would like to put before you in terms of an introduction. Professor Steckeler, please. Now, I would like to come back to Professor Schön, who quoted August von Hayek and morals as a testing action, so to speak. I mean, that's an excellent example to show what the relationship between morals and the law is, because we have situations in which you can move freely, but then we also have the assessment or the evaluation of the law in order to find out whether the law you have is the right one. And the crisis we are observing today is not a legal crisis, it's a crisis of trust or confidence. And it's important to be aware of this particular nature of the crisis, because philosophers talk about ethics and morals, and then we have to see the soft aspects and the testing ground I have referred to, and the fundamental questions which should not be forgotten. And then, of course, we have also an obligation to not talk about the revolution only, but also about the possibility to understand the concepts, the property law, for example, or property rights, copyrights in digital times. I mean, people feel that if they copy something, they don't take it away from somebody else, which is not to be compared to theft or taking something away from someone, and which is very different from shoplifting, for example. However, the perspective of a person who puts something online might be a completely different one. So you really have to go and explain what it's all about. This is not about didactics only. This is also about the question, why do you want to have the added value system, which is what the political party of the pirates says. I mean, this is added value system, and I don't agree to the system, because if I copy something, I don't take it away from a person. He or she still owns it. And all this is also connected to the idea of confidence. So this is also pedagogics and ethics. It's not about the revolution only. Now, I'm a historian, and I am interested in the collective unlawfulness, which is an expression of societal action. Something is possible all of a sudden, and that's why people agree to break the law. And then there is the contravention also as a consequence of a social situation, and to break the law might ultimately also mean freedom. And I'm reminding you of ideas developed in 1789, when the great modern legal system was created, which we still stick to today: the freedom of trade, personality rights, the rights of settlement, the right of political participation, and legal equality and equity. Now, this principle has proven right for more than 200 years, with small interruptions in Europe, in particular in Eastern Europe, first after 1917, and then after 1945-48 in Eastern Europe, when countries returned to the old law once again by breaking the law, by adopting the Western law. Now, I don't want to focus on other cases of broken laws which proved to be major collective learning experiences, and which are still the counter history we are facing today. Now, this might be the leverage for the historian, because the question is, what happens now? What are the possibilities we have today if we want to change the law beyond contraventions? Now, property rights or copyrights and patent law and the rights of the person are important cases or examples, because here major processes happen, major transformations seem to be underway, with predecessors and with follow-up action in terms of the law. And Professor Schön has well described what we are talking about. On the one hand, you have the predecessors, for example, the book. And we talked about the book and how we deal with cultural goods and the concept of property with respect to digital media, the press, television, and later the computer, were the segments we talked about, the sectors we talked about, and then eventually the internet and digitization, which have led to a fundamental conflict, because the digitization and the internet allows for completely different activities, different from the old media. So social practice is more advanced today. Napster is a file-sharing program developed by students on a campus in the USA. And first of all, they wanted to swap files they share, which is what you normally do in a peer group of younger people. And then eventually they go beyond the college, and the swapping process is also one with peers in Europe or in Asia. And according to a traditional idea of the copyright, this is a contravention. This is unlawful. And this is the major question we have to focus on, because the unlawfulness has to be seen also in the context of the cultural and the social dimension. The individual contravention, that's not the state contravention, right? Professor Pichler. Well, thank you, Dr. Flick. I could limit myself and say they are all right. Another possibility would be to go on and play the role I have played in the last 24 hours and say things people maybe don't want to hear. I'm at the left here accidentally, the extreme left accidentally. So, however, in the last 24 hours, I've had a different opinion from what you've heard so far. I'm not sitting here in my capacity as a professor for European law. And actually, I feel like I should have to tell you the truth with respect to the understanding of the concept of law and the conditions connected to the idea of lawfulness. And I should tell you all this so that you understand what the real danger is. And there are lots of people out there who do not want to see the danger anymore. Now, unlawfulness or contraventions or non-compliance could be a way to go beyond a legal system, but I do see contraventions also among people who normally comply with the law, like bicycle riders, for example. They live according to a natural law. They don't comply with the law. They break the law, but they don't consider this a breaking of the law, but they consider the driver of a car the end or the decline of the Western world. So this is not about leadership, and there are expectations with respect to the law. And what you understand by law or lawfulness is based on what you expect from the law. And there are those who have expectations, and these expectations are being fulfilled. And there are those whose expectations are not being fulfilled, and they turn away from the law. And I'm talking about Austria only, and I would like to be protected. I'm a minority. I'm the only Austrian on this stage. Sometimes we move into the big world, the world far away. 95% of the Austrians in the last few years are no longer proud of our policy, and there are good reasons why. And 78% of the Austrians asked say that you want to take care of legal matters themselves. They would like to have a democratic system, participatory democratic system. 64% have said for 10 years already that at law court they do not expect justice, which is shocking, actually. And about 40% tell us that they do expect some justice from the judges, or maybe it's 60%. So they differentiate law courts and the judges. Now, this is about expectations. They want to have a law because they want to have justice. And this is not formal justice, but material justice. And secondly, uniformity or harmony. Is it possible? Can the law guarantee harmony? And thirdly, legal security. They want to have security, and they want to have it guaranteed by the law. And that's the fourth expectation. They want to have the law guarantee peace. And if there are not enough guarantees, or if these expectations are not being fulfilled, people turn away from the law. And this is the real reality, the reality people live and experience. And that's the moment we have reached right now. Where are we? Now, with respect to the recent Austrian polls, where we were right in front of the abyss, and we have gone one step further. That's the situation. I mean, look at Austria and what has happened here in the last 24 or 48 hours. I mean, people want justice, but of course this doesn't help us solve our problems, because there is a reorientation we observe in the society, and maybe I'm the only left-wing person who is in favor of controlling the law. But then you said the same, Corinne. Flick in your introduction, and then we have another person here who is normally not considered a left-wing man, but still he agrees. So obviously, slowly but gradually, people are beginning to understand that we need more control. I've said in the morning that the capacity of control in society, by society, via the law, was denied consciously. We said the markets can do it much better, and we withdrew from our possibility to control. A legal crisis, that's what we called it. Professor Schön, please.
Well, with regard to what my colleague has said, I would like to come back to the case studies and try to find a sort of common thread. And there is the idea of perception and the consideration of law. It's not that we are giving it less esteem. No, it's functional. The legal position of property from the family, from a contract, this is not seen as such. It's something that has to become legitimate, first of all. There's a nice book written by a psychiatrist, The Inability to Say No, and he describes a situation of somebody who lent someone 30 euros, and the day it is due, he says, I want my 30 euros back. And the debtor said, do you need that money? So if this is an admissible question, then we are already seeing everything in relative terms. The legal position is no longer valid, and everything needs to be legitimized. The situation is quite the same when it comes to use of content from the web. Copyright is clear, but then we have the illegal download. And then the question that the mass movement is asking is, do they really need the money? Mr. Kreil is here with us today. He can answer that question. Don't they have enough profit? Aren't they all in a situation of a monopoly? We can talk about all of that. We have to talk about that in long term and also in terms of the legal aspects, taking into account the situation where you are calling for what you have coming to you. You really shouldn't be able to ask the question, do you need that money? But today, the situation is such that we consider the situation with Greece. I think it's not all that much different, although I don't want to go into details on that. During the break, somebody asked me if maybe one of the answers to our overall topic might not be we need a common set of values where we would have legally binding and moral values, and these to be used for what we are requesting. I said, yes, in a society which has so little homogeneous, this is something that is only something that can be determined in our Constitution, with the basic rights, in the rule of law, and the ideas of justice. And this would certainly suffice for a whole lot. And I'm quite surprised that the European states have put much less value compared to the United States when it comes to making the contents of the Constitution known. If we were successful there, then I think we would have a lot of basic information so that we could overcome a number of conflicts. But there is a little problem there. You could say in moral terms they are obliged to do so. But the problem is they say everybody else is doing it as well and nobody is sanctioning it. So it's not only a question of do they need that money, and it's not only a question of do I like the rules. this is a question, is it something that can be enforced by means of sanctions? We have a similar situation when it comes to tax justice or tax evasion, which is sanctioned if we don't even do any research on this. So the whole laissez-faire here really undermines the law. And because the law then just remains moral, and you're not going to get very far with just an appeal. And I ride my bike a lot too, and there's always a battle between car drivers and cyclists. And if you take a lot of the bike paths, and I use a racing bike, and you go up the steps, either you ruin your bike or you are in danger because you have to go on the road all the time. Because, of course, the rules and the traffic situation should be such that you can go by bike. So I think this is the putting the blame here and there is also something that we have to consider for the drivers as well. Well, you must not be in this precarious intermediate position. Either you see to it that everything is enforced, or you remove the law. But if all of the population is in a situation where they are not sanctioned, and then you also consider the political situation, that's not the right answer to this question. Well, let me contradict what you've said. Not everything really is breaking the law. When we talk about the private use of something you've downloaded, then this is not breaking the law in Austria. But I also believe that if there are property rights that are infringed, then they should be persecuted. There is also, we've heard that again and again, but you also have to realize that it's a new situation. If we've got something totally new in the younger generations, we've got 3.0, and we have very constructive principles. People live together. They also share information, and they provide the information to the whole wide world. They cooperate. They generate new knowledge for the world. So there's a lot of altruism here as well, and a lot of new ideas. And there's a lot of new political communication out there as well. And you have to remember the open government structure introduced by Obama. We also see the citizens' participation in the web. And this is also something that should be made use of, because this is participating democracy. And this then links the population, if they're involved in the whole beginning of all of this. That is to say, there's a great deal of hope as a result of these new developments. But these are not breaking the law. This is creativity, for example, that can exist. So it's a new subject matter. So I'm very pleased with the last thing that you said. It's much more optimistic. In the meantime, I had the impression that our discussion was going to become very pessimistic. We heard about law at risk, and we heard about putting law in relative terms, and then added more to it. And I would say, okay, let's slow down. Careful there. We talk about crisis, collapse, and the fact that certain things are at risk. That usually doesn't help us out. But when we talk about collectively breaking the law and the problems that result from this, then the first thing we should do is see that a lot of our legal system works quite well. And we don't really take a look at the part that's working. If you build a new building and that somebody comes from the authorities and approves it, and maybe there's the fire extinguisher is not there, so that has to be bought, and the whole fire extinguishing system doesn't work, then of course it might delay opening of the building by 9 months. So it works. I think the laws work. We'll just have to go to Berlin. And so maybe the laws do work. They require certain things that must be in place, and certain actions have to be taken. So these are things you have to realize as well. I don't think we should see everything all so negatively. and consider that this is the collapse of our legal system. No, but one thing that is a major problem that we need to pay attention to, and this has been mentioned already, I'd like to stress the fact that we need to make sure that our law takes into account elementary justice. And this is something that I certainly would not want to put too much content into. Justice meaning equality in the application of our laws, and also equality when it comes to privileges, for example, within our legal system. And this would help to make our laws accepted and would lead to an attitude which could then prevent collective abuse of laws, and then all of the basic principles that need to be included in our Constitution. But then we have another problem. This is where the problems begin. And if you discuss this in more detail, you usually find quite quickly that there aren't all that many basic values that can be agreed on in a pluralistic society. But if we look after these basic principles that are in our laws, and if we look after them carefully, then this would also be a time-tested means to avoid breaking of laws. You can talk about Europe, the banks, etc., when we talk about laws. Well, let's recognize law as a value. Let's take one step back before we talk about contents, that law in itself is a value. Isn't that being lost? But we were talking about something being legal and illegal. Law can be functional by simply referring to a certain type of cooperation. And law can also reinforce some of the moral and ethical values. And we need to keep these two apart. If we see them in parallel, then the question is, why do we have these rules? What is their purpose? They serve someone else and not us. And that's exactly why functional law and the reinforcement of cooperation and these values are seen next to one another. They can't all be seen together. I think in terms of teaching and also in terms of ethics, it can confuse people. So we have to talk about these categories of something being legal and something not being legal. But in a democracy, we have an institutional approach. We have elections and referenda, and if there is a group within the state, social groups that say they have their hands on the solution, then of course we have to assert ourselves in the political process. We talked about ACTA. That was something that went much too far when it came to this initiative. There were NGOs that addressed the European Parliament, and if you go through with all of this, the result is that these regulations were not introduced. So we are having two discussions in parallel, one which is outside the Parliament, and then one that relates to the law and the Constitution and something that can be enforced by the institutions. That's unacceptable. But we have the problem of the legal and ethical protagonists. For example, in homosexuals, or when it comes to categories of questions there of and Hugel also refers to the question of different questions, and he had to be executed, of course. And that is not saying that this is what he deserved, but it was something that he was a protagonist here. And this is something that was not as a group, but it was also somebody who's calling upon the groups to break the law. The same applies to Jesus. So, example, we must not be too conservative, and we shouldn't be all that conservative here. But let me give you another example in the other direction. You're talking about the reforms in sexual criminal law. In the 60s or 70s, remember the discussions on the protection by the constitutional law, the question on abortions, and the legislature just passed a law which would be an absolute minimum when it comes to protecting unborn life. A different physician would have to give a certificate, certain deadlines have to be met, but everybody knows that nonetheless it was possible to have an abortion in Germany. There was a doctor in Memmingen who said he wouldn't even abide by that law. He wouldn't ask for another certificate from another physician. The minimum requirements were not met. The public prosecutor filed charges against him, and then the press went against the public prosecutor. So the public opinion was against the state that was saying that this absolute minimum would only be carried out in just one individual case. In such a situation, this is a situation we must not arrive at. If we have to check the law by the parliament, by the constitutional court, and then you have to have reached a point where you say, okay, this is the way it's going to be, and it will be enforced. Well, I think we should go for therapy rather than prognosis. When we talk about this, it's a question of legal acceptance, and this needs to be improved. We need legal acceptance in a pluralistic society. If we can agree that the consensus that we have is something that is maintained, that's what I mean by legal acceptance and acceptance of the system. And this is something that must be improved. You mentioned a book called Give the People Their State, Give Them Back Their State. And we're talking here about a politician. Well, we don't want to talk about the political parties, but it's all related. When we say give the people their rights back, and that is to say the political parties, and this is something that we can no longer afford, and that's why in Austria we talk about the implementation of democracy, because politics have also recognized what their limits are, and they're still on the right track. I'm very optimistic here. I'm sure we will make progress, and that's what's necessary at this point in time.